Imagine for a second that you are a singularity and say you ask the question, do I know everything and am I everything? And then, of course, how would you possibly test that hypothesis? Would you possibly create little buckets of yourself or little pieces of yourself? In other words, create little pieces of yourself in the image of who you actually are and send these pieces of sentient pieces of yourself. The best analogy I ever heard to explain this was delivered by Wayne Dyer. He was standing on a stage once. We were on a cruise. We were on the Pacific Ocean, and he held up a bucket of water and he said to us, "What's in the bucket?" And we went, "Well, water." He went, "No." He went, "This is the Pacific Ocean." Because what I did was I dragged the bucket over the side of the boat and I picked up Pacific Ocean. So yes, outside the boat, there's the Pacific Ocean, but this is also the Pacific Ocean. And exactly the same thing is true when we talk about being sentient pieces of God. So here, sentient pieces of God, or each of us have different terms, don't we? Some people call the source of everything source. Some people call it prime creator. Some people refer to the singularity. Some people refer to this singularity as God. So each of us have a different description. And guess what? As the singularity is everything and consists of everything, any description you have is in fact correct. So imagine, let's take a step back and imagine we are the singularity, and now we want to know, are we indeed everything, and do we indeed know everything? So we send out these little sentient pieces of ourselves, and the objective of those sentient pieces, or those buckets of us made in our image, the purpose or their purpose is to go out and to experience absolutely everything. So if you are a bucket of sentient God or sentient source, and you're going out with the objective of finding out and understanding everything there is to know, you would have to live every probability, right? So imagine now these sentient pieces of self, sentient pieces of source, should I say, have gone out. Now what they need to do is they need to experience everything. So in other words, every probability is possible. So in order for them to go out and experience every probability, that is what we refer to as timeline. So every possible probability that can occur is a different timeline. How do we align ourselves and move between timelines? Well, it's all related to the choices we make or the choices we don't make. How do we, or should I rather say, what drives the choices? The choices I'm talking about here is there's two types of timelines. So there's collective timelines and then there's individual timelines. So let's first explore the construct of collective timelines. So what decides the collective consciousness of humanity? How does the collective consciousness of humanity travel on a timeline? Because remember, whether you know about this stuff or you don't know about this stuff, you have to be on a timeline. So collectively, we're on a timeline. What decides which timeline we're going to occupy? Well, that's decided by the choices we make. What dictates the choices that humanity is going to make? Well, it comes back to the programming, right? So unfortunately, there has been a group of nefarious individuals or beings that has built a system, right? In other words, they've built a whole system, a mainstream media. They've built an educational system. They've built an entire system of control. In other words, there's peer-reviewed science. They've got all sorts of other things. Like, for example, they also do marketing. So there's big business does marketing. There's public relations. There's movies, right? They create movies. They create television shows, or should I rather say television programs, which program our minds. In the last half of this video, or the rest of this video, we can explain to you how do we actually become programmed? In other words, as I said to you, the timeline that we as a collective consciousness inhabit or occupy is dictated by the choices we make. Okay, so what then guides or dictates the choices we make? Well, it's all related to whatever we believe, whatever we think. So imagine for a moment, we are on a timeline, or should I rather say we're being pushed onto a very, very low optimal timeline for the cabal, the Illuminati, or the deep state, or the Khazarian mafia. That timeline, their optimal timeline, is one of enslavement, one where humanity lives in a bubble of debt and fear and war and famine. Now imagine when you are, and what is causing us to make all the choices that are pushing us onto that timeline? Well, we are being indoctrinated. The mainstream media isn't reporting the news, they're creating the news. Our educational system isn't educating our children, it's indoctrinating our children to think in a certain way. In other words, authority is trust. Trust peer-reviewed science. So let's review peer-reviewed science. Peer-reviewed science, for example, all you need to do is you want to get an outcome, you bribe the first scientist, he gets an outcome, and then of course you bribe a second scientist who gets the same outcome. Now you've got peer-reviewed science. What about the movies, right? So we got Hollywood. Hollywood's creating shows all the time that are kind of pre-programming us to get an understanding of what's to come. Let me give you an example of COVID, right? So how did they start programming us? How did they start getting us to start thinking about COVID? In other words, aligning ourselves with a timeline where COVID actually occurred. All the way back in 2012 at the Olympic Games, the opening and closing ceremonies at the Olympic Games were all about hospital beds and syringes. At the time, I thought, wow, this is really strange. But now in hindsight, and then of course, at the Commonwealth Games, they did exactly the same thing. And then as time was going on, they exposed us to bird flu, then mad cow disease, then it was swine flu, and then of course, COVID. But in the interim, as they were building us up, pushing us gradually onto their timeline, so they made television shows, they made movies, all priming us, getting us into that mind space. In other words, pushing us towards a place where we accepted that, okay, COVID was inevitable. And then, of course, they had a conference in 2019, pandemic preparedness. So they were constantly putting this into the human psyche from every possible angle so that we were being pushed from the most optimal timelines. What are the most optimal timelines for humanity? Those are timelines of love, peace, tranquility, joy, abundance. But what do these guys do is they create in the human psyche, already starting in 2012, right back at the opening and closing ceremonies of the Olympic Games, they already started programming us, pushing us onto the least optimal timelines so that when COVID did eventually occur on that timeline, it was keeping us completely depressed and on very, very low timelines. In other words, optimal timelines for the cabal, the Illuminati, the Khazarian Mafia, timelines where they're in control, timelines where we are manipulated and propaganda is used against us. And when COVID came along, think about it. When you are in a state of shock, right? Because that's exactly what they use. They create a state of shock, something like COVID. And then, guys, we become very programmable. We become very susceptible. We become very likely to move onto the most optimal timelines for the Khazarian Mafia and the least optimal timelines for us. Then, of course, on a daily basis, they're programming us with the language we use. In the rest of the video, I'm actually going to explain to you why we say things like good morning, right? What is another something that sounds like morning? It's when somebody dies, when you awake in the morning. What is awake? Awake is something that you go to when somebody dies. Remember, we earn a living. Well, earn, what goes in an urn? The ashes from the person who died after you've attended the wake. Guys, do you understand? We are being programmed and coerced and propagandized and indoctrinated and manipulated and pushed away from the most optimal timelines, the best timelines for us, namely ones of love, passion, joy, abundance, love. Those are the timelines where we will be optimal. But what timelines? All the programming, everything that these monsters are doing is constantly pushing us onto the most optimal, the low timelines for us and the high timelines for